Well, hello and welcome to the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce's Q&A series focusing on the crisis in Ukraine. I'm Raj Kandola, Head of Policy and Strategic Relationships at the Chamber. Now, the aim of this series is to engage with expert members and Chamber patrons to help inform local businesses the key issues resulting from the crisis and the implications that the crisis might have on the business community. Now, for more information about the work that the Chamber is doing on the Ukraine crisis, please visit the Russia-Ukraine Crisis Hub on our website. Now, today I'm joined by Tom Pugh, UK economist at RSM, to discuss the state of the economy and how, 2 months on from our original Q&A video, businesses are still being affected. Well, Tom, thanks very much for joining us today. I mean, obviously, there's been so much happening in the last couple of months, but since our last video, obviously, inflation is at a 40-year high, and the UK faces a concerning cost of living crisis. I mean, to what extent do you think the war in Ukraine has contributed to the current rate of inflation?
Right. Yeah. I mean, if we look at kind of what's been driving inflation, kind of the three standout causes are obviously energy, so electricity, natural gas, petrol, and food prices, which are really kind of ramping up now. All three of those have been kind of heavily impacted by the war in Ukraine. You know, Ukraine's a massive exporter of grains, oils, other foodstuffs. Russia obviously is a huge exporter of natural gas and oil.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I wouldn't put a number on it, but it seems quite obvious that the war in Ukraine is really driving that portion of inflation, which is probably half of the inflation we've seen. It's not 100% because even before at the start of the year, so January, early Feb, we were seeing quite tight energy markets and food prices rising anyway. But I think the main impact has been that the peak of inflation has obviously been much higher than it was. Back in January we were talking about a peak of maybe 5-6%, and we then expected it to kind of fall back down to target quite quickly in the second half of that year. That's obviously not going to happen anymore. We're expecting inflation's kind of hit 10% towards the end of the year, and then it'll be kind of the end of 2023 before it comes down. And I think a lot of that extra peak and that longer peak, I think you can attribute quite a lot of that to the Ukraine crisis.
Yeah, and I guess what's been really surprising to see is just how quickly inflation has risen over the last few months. Obviously, at the start of the year, as we know, obviously restrictions around the world were kind of lifted in a number of countries related to COVID-19. Obviously, lots of demand there as well. So, obviously, the Bank of England recently warned of a potential recession on the horizon as a result of global geopolitical issues, including the crisis in Ukraine, which obviously you've touched upon. But what do you think is the current economic outlook for the next few months?
Yeah, so we just spoke about inflation. That is obviously the massive, the big kind of issue that's going to be with us for at least another year. So that means real wages, which are the amount of money you have in your pocket once you've kind of accounted for inflation. Real wages are probably going to fall at probably 3.5% that this year. That will be a kind of record drop. So that obviously doesn't set the scene very well for a very kind of robust, booming economy. Normally we would expect if there was a 3% fall in kind of real incomes, that would be pretty much a guaranteed recession. There's a couple of factors that I think are different this time. One is that there's the labor market is very tight. The unemployment rate is the lowest it's been in 40-50 years. So what that means is that people aren't that worried about losing their jobs. Normally, kind of when we're approaching a recession, we have what's called the paradox of thrift, which is where people are worried about losing their job. So they stop spending, they start saving. That lowers aggregate demand in the economy, which lessens the demand for labor, leads to those job losses. So if people aren't particularly worried about losing their jobs, or if they know if they do, they'll be able to find something else quite quickly, it means that imperative to kind of stop spending and start saving isn't there in such the way that it has been leading up to other kind of recessions. The second factor is that we know that household balance sheets are really, really strong. There's 250 billion pounds worth of savings kind of stashed away in household bank accounts that they can draw upon in order to kind of lessen that hit from inflation. There's an issue around, obviously most of those savings are held by the wealthier kind of end of the spectrum. And we know that, as always, in these kind of inflation environments, people at the lowest end of the income scales get hit hardest. But in aggregate, household balance sheets are pretty strong, and that will allow consumers to continue to spend more than they otherwise would do when faced with this kind of massive shock to real incomes. So that's why we're not forecasting a recession, but we're forecasting pretty meager growth over the next year. I think we've got something like an average of 0.1 or even 0 kind of average growth over the next year. So it really won't take much to kind of tip us over into that recession. If we have another supply chain crisis, for example, this summer, or another spike in energy prices, that's the kind of thing that probably would tip us over.
Yeah, completely. Now, an interest rate rise is looking inevitable for next month, but do you think there's anything that could be done from a fiscal point of view to help those businesses that have been impacted by this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right now that an interest rate rise is coming in June. I think the labour market and inflation data that we've had recently probably nails that on. But remember, there was kind of 3 members of the MPC who didn't want to include any guidance in the report that they were going to continue raising interest rates. So there's definitely kind of a division on the MPC as to how much further interest rates need to go. In terms of fiscal policy, I think it's pretty inevitable, given recent comments from the Chancellor, that we're going to see more support from the government in terms of certainly energy prices. We think Ofgem is going to probably raise the energy price cap by another 30 or 40% in October. So there'll probably be some sort of fiscal support announced in the budget, if not before, to kind of take some of the sting out of that. But I think it's worth, I think it's worth pointing out that this, any fiscal stimulus needs to be targeted, very targeted at those on the kind of lower end of the income scheme. As we explained in the previous question, wealthier households have this massive pool of savings that they can draw down upon to help cushion the blow from those higher energy prices, higher oil prices. Households at the lower end of the income spectrum just don't have that cushion to draw upon, and they're the ones that really need that kind of government support.
Yeah, very much. Again, obviously, just speaking to a number of businesses right now, particularly SMEs, who are really struggling with the cost of living crisis, but also repaying the debts they accrued during the pandemic. So it's a bit of a perfect storm at the minute. So, no, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really helpful. So for those chamber members tuning in, please feel free to liaise with your relationship manager if you require any further information or support in relation to what's been discussed today. Thank you all.